The Memoirs of George Sperryhawke, written by Austin C. Smith, narrated by Liam Taylor. Prologue. When Mr. Boswell, upon the occasion of the Treaty of Paris, first proposed writing my biography, I declined the honour, as I deemed it a vanity, and one not likely to please His Majesty King George. I have no need for acclamation, and have never felt the need to crow upon the bones of the conquered. Of course, I knew at the time that my refusal would lead other men of baser character and lower birth to lay claim to those deeds that in truth were wrought by my own hands. But that so many fools might try to bask in the splendour of my achievements was more a cause for amusement rather than indignation. No man of substance could possibly believe that such or such a thing was done by that half-breed mongrel Alexander Hamilton, or that miserly coward Colonel Washington. Let them compete for the praise of the mob. Alas, the treachery of my enemies has forced me to reconsider my initial position on the matter. These persons, Mr. Jonathan Cruikshank, Esquire, chief among them, have resolved through 1,000 forms of slander, of malice, and of libellous venom, to give to the world a wholly deceptive portrait of the harrispects of Cambridge, as I have often been known to men of fashion. And not content with printing such malicious lies, twice now have they sought a writ from the legislature to have me arraigned on charges of spying, of treason, of war profiteering, and sedition. Ha! Such is their innocence. A man such as myself may yet succumb to any number of honourable defeats or misfortunes, but he cannot be brought down by so common a contrivance as the law. Thus I am resolved to correct the record, so that posterity may know the truth. And seeing as Mr. Boswell is long since dead, and has no living equal in the world of biographical letters, I am obliged to render these memoirs by my own hand. On that score, I will say that the writing of memoir and history I consider a very low calling, similar to coppersmithing or brickmaking. The rearrangement of words and the correction of syntax may be very necessary, but they will not work for a gentleman. As such, I will make very little effort in these pages. Indeed, I consider enthusiasm of any sort to be very servile. Thus, it is fortunate for the reader that the narrative of my life has no need for puffery or enthusiasm. My deeds will speak for themselves. And such deeds! What triumphs! I negotiated the sale of Louisiana to Mr. Jefferson, in a deal that should have seen the President impeached for so reckless a use of the public purse, and ordered a drafting of what would become the Buttonwood Agreement. It was my refusal to pay tribute to the heretic Mogul that forced our nation's entry into the Barbary Wars, and the first Bank of the United States was created to repay notes I held from the Revolution, an institution that I then dissolved when the interest rates turned against me. Nor have my exploits been confined to the New World. I have won great fortunes in every corner of the globe, and bedded over 1,000 of the loveliest women of our age, here in America, and also in France, Holland, and many of the German principates. As to my progeny, His Excellency the Archbishop of York, His Grace the Duke of and His Majesty the King of each of these lords and gentlemen are my bastards. I led the dirge at Captain Nelson's funeral, which the editors of Punch and the Spectator swore moved His Majesty to tears. I was asked as the only witness to the morganatic marriage of Charles Phillip and served as the honorary chairman of the Worshipful Company of Goldsmiths during the Panic of 1802. And my accomplishments in field sports were no less grand. I rode out regularly with the Crawley, Kimblewick, and Northumberland hunts, and bowled an oxtail against his Grace Duke Louis at Windmill Down. I boxed with Prince Frederick in the famous match at the Yard at Christchurch, whereafter his Highness presented me with a full wheel of Gloucester cheese, and half a cask of claret from the royal cellars. And during the minority of his Grace the Duke of Somerset, I was made interim heraldic falconer, an honour that entitled me to a stipend of £1,000 from the royal purse, and a fully dressed deer twice annually from Richmond Park. My clerks, who are the most meticulous and competent scribes in all the Commonwealth, assure me that my accounts are measured in the hundreds of thousands of dollars, and the editor of the New York Evening Post has twice declared that I am a millionary. When I drive through Boston, I do so in a 6-horse stanhope that was presented to me by the French ambassador, and cost 32,000 francs. My wardrobe has been appraised as being equal or greater to the Prince of Wales, including 6 pairs of hand-stitched cavalier and hussar boots, and a collection of silk hats made by Mr. John Hetherington. I have a stable of prize racehorses in Virginia, 2 of whom are champions of the steeplechase at dawn. I have 80,000 acres of land throughout the Americas, where my chattels harvest flax, hemp, wheat, rice, lumber, cotton, and tobacco and corn. I have a musket factory in Baltimore, a cannon factory in Richmond, a bank in London, 2 textile factories in Manchester, and a fleet of ships and a railway line that carry my goods to every port in the world. I have a townhouse in Boston that I let to the British ambassador at £42 a week, and a sprawling estate at Newbury adorned with costly sculptures and marble fountainets. I have friends and apartments in every court in Europe, and 1,000 dependents stretched across 3 continents. And thus may I say, without exaggeration, that I am the most splendid man of my generation. Now I sit here, beside a low fire, and these episodes of my life dance before me in the pillows of smoke cast out from the hearth. I have small time left on this earth. Soon the Almighty shall call me away to my reward, and it shall be a great mercy. I have gout, spots on the lungs, and a tumour growing in my throat. I have gravel in the liver, and poor circulation. Time and hard living have usurped my youth, and left me a frail, tired, though eminently regal creature. But do not think I am living in any sort of discomfort. Quite the contrary. At the appointed hour, my footman will bring me a scrumptious dinner of roasted duck or fresh fish, along with fried squash, butternut or acorn, as I fancy, pâté, liver, mousse, and then chocolates, cherries, figs, walnuts, brandy, and coffee, all served in costly porcelain, silver, and pewter. My groom will bring me slippers, lined in mink, medical ointment for my foot, hot towels and lilac water, amorous letters from royal princesses, and anything else I should require. He will be dressed in costly livery, and bow before me on this floor made of imported Italian marble, and it is all right and well that they should do so. I remain a loyal Englishman, and a Tory. Like all young men, I shall not deny that I too flirted with various Whiggish and Republican sentiments, and was endeared by the juvenile musings of Messrs. Franklin and Payne. But I have now seen these blasphemies for what they are, Jacobinism, itself a mere proxy for the most trifling of boyhood resentments, seeks to topple every church spire and mutilate every beauty, so that all the world becomes as vile as the contemptible sans-culottes. These Jacobins would exterminate horses because they never learn to ride, and rid the world of sugar-plums because they haven't any teeth. But in all truth, the great mass of men have as much use for liberty as I have for a begging bowl. On that score, I will say that our revolution was a disgraceful enterprise, and had it not been for the cowardly machinations of that prig John Adams, I should have succeeded in foiling the ambitions of those so-called patriots. Theirs was an ignoble pursuit, and though I had been vocal and notorious in my support of the good King George, my power and influence were such that the victory of those traitors could no more endanger me than the coming of winter may endanger the ancient oak. As for my family, I too could manufacture a genealogy worthy of Dozier, Burke, or the Almanach de Gotha, and trace by contrivance my descent through a noble lord, back still to a medieval thane of the Garter, and, if you like, all the way to William the First. And what of it? What would that say of me that is not better shown by a tour through my gardens, and a hunt paid for from my own purse, replete with the most extravagant and noble accoutrement? Thus, unlike so many pretenders to gentility, I freely own that I was born into a family of no consequence. In fact, there was a time when I was refused intercourse by the better families of the Commonwealth, the Winthrops, Crowninshields, and the Thorndikes. They called me a bounder and a smuggler, and insisted that I was an unlettered buccaneer. Indeed, Mrs. Samuel Crowninshield once remarked that I had the manners of a fishmonger, and the graces of a farrier. Worse, at Miss Daisy Crownshield's debut, I was intentionally mistaken for a coacher, and asked to await my master at the side door, an insult which I assure you I have made those Crowninshield derelicts pay for not once or twice, but 1,000 times, and an insult which their progeny will continue to pay so long as I am alive. Ask anyone. Ask any newsboy in the North End if any man called Crowninshield is now able to secure a sloop at the dock, or a loan from the bank, or a stand for the legislative. He will tell you such a thing is impossible. But the rest of these so-called Brahmin have seen fit to revisit their opinion of Sperryhawke, and now they eagerly compete for the honour of winning the hand of a Sperryhawke in marriage, and call upon my sons for capital, political support, and patronage of all varieties. They have no quibble about eating from my table now. Many of these ne'er-do-wells have spent years gorged upon my chef's hefty cuts of venison, and drunk upon 1,000 butts of Burgundy supplied from my cellars. And when I pass them in Boston Common, do they not clamber to inform their companion that they are acquainted with the great Sperryhawke? Do they not gape at my equipage, and inquire, "Mr. Sperryhawke, where did you acquire that bottle-green coat?" They do all of these things and more. Indeed, my knowledge of their existence is the closest thing to prominence they shall achieve in this life. So it is no idle boast to state that I have made Sperryhawke the greatest name in all of Massachusetts, indeed, perhaps in all America. This, I submit, is a fine achievement for a boy who was born into poverty, such as would make an Irishman weep. And the poverty was appalling. The family farm into which I was reared was little more than an outhouse, attached to 3 measly acres of turnips, set back from the northern edge of the Kennebec River. The floor of our house was made of earth and rock, sewn tight with bullock's blood, and we had not even herbs or rushes to disguise the sight or odours. We had a pig there, just in the kitchen, and 3 hens besides. And it was just there, in the dirt, atop a few sprigs of hay, that I rested my head each night, along with my brothers and sisters. My father, a Mr. Jeremiah Sperryhawke, had come over from England as a domestic in the service of Mr. Ameswell Hortonrock. I know the shame of it. Although my father was bound to 7 years of labour in exchange for his release from debtor's prison and his passage to the New World, Mr. Hortonrock saw fit to end his tenure after only 19 months. And in this estimation, I believe Mr. Hortonrock was entirely correct. My father was a worthless old sot, whose want of labour forced my family into an appalling state of subsistence. Oh, how I can even today recall the shame of the Sperryhawkes. Though Jeremiah was a freethinker, my mother was a devout soul, and insisted we make the journey each Sunday to service. I recall how I used to sit in envy of the merchants' sons and the lawyers' sons, how they dressed in fine velvet and well-fitting breeches, and adorned their hair with handsome bows, how they all complimented and embraced one another, but would scoff and snicker whence their Sperryhawkes ushered into the pews. Their pride was as unbearable as it was unmerited. And yet I will confess that jealousy so consumed me that I contemplated suicide on more than one occasion, I assure you. But as raised as I was amid such appalling deprivation, I always had very high tastes, which I can only surmise were sown into my constitution by the Almighty himself. I recall sitting at table in the kitchen and instructing my mother as to the proper manner in which to prepare my meals. "Mother, be a dear and cut my carrots, Julienne, and perhaps a sprig of parsley round the potato to give the plate some colour." In hindsight, I will agree that these were unreasonable demands upon a kind woman who had enough trouble as it was putting food on the table and keeping our father out of the stockades. Father, who was generally drunk by the dinner hour, he used to scoff. "What fine gentleman's airs you have, Georgie!" Of course, we had no money, but I yet always tried to do my best with the few scraps of clothes given me. I would cut away the excess material from the rags we boys were dressed in, so that the fabric clung smartly to my form, as I had seen the better quality of boys in town wear their clothing. And oftentimes, when appropriate, I would use the excess fabric to tie my hair into a fine bow. Alas, not even my perseverance or high tastes could save us from the genuine consequence of poverty. In fact, things became so bad in the winter of '53 that 3 of my brothers died of dropsy. Nigel, Herbert, and that other one, whose name now escapes me. They were my blood, and my most prized possessions. But owing to the lack of food, to the lack of warmth, to the lack of clean water, and the lack of basic necessities, these boys died deaths cruel and senseless. And to make matters all the worse, I was obliged to bury them both with mine own hands, for our father could not even afford the cost of a Christian burial. When I had reached a man's bearing, and was able to discern the source of my family's misfortune, I could not abide any more of our honour sacrificed upon the altar of that man's idleness. He had failed in the harvest once again, and though he assigned the fault to the drought, it was in fact owing to his ignorance of agronomy and proper irrigation. And thus it came to pass that I resolved to have it out with Mr. Jeremiah Sperryhawke. I recall that evening vividly. He had been out, as he normally was, at the alehouse, where he claimed to seek work. I waited for him there, just on the lone stool in the kitchen. He came stumbling through the door, his face distorted from gin and tobacco smoke. I at once knocked him down and set upon him. He still had a full foot of height on me, and yet owing to his drunkenness he was unable to defend himself. I kicked him twice, hard in the stomach, and broke the lonely stool over the back of his skull. He began to raise himself in defence, whence I struck him hard across the face with the back of my fist. Thence, grabbing him by the thick of his neck, I smashed his face something awful, and compressed it thoroughly into the peat moss of the wall, all the while berating him with clever insults. My mother watched this confrontation, and pleaded with me to cease my violence, though in truth I believe she was secretly impressed by my daring. Of course, this assault was a capital offence, near to patricide in the law, and it was thus necessary for me to remove myself from the family stead. And so I tied away my few things and prepared to put out into the world. Looking back over those 70 years, I can still see the figure of my mother, standing at the crest of the door of that wretched farmhouse, dotting her eyes with a soiled piece of linen. She threw herself at my feet, and begged me not to desert her. The poor woman's suffering touched me deeply, but I refused. And so it was that in the winter of '57 that I quit the house of my youth, an outcast, alone and penniless, but resolved to make myself a gentleman. I shall not now tell in any great detail of the many fantastic adventures of those early years, of the days spent wandering the post road towards Boston, how I laboured through snowdrifts and fought with wild animals for a dry place to sleep, nor of the scoundrel Peter Plimpton, that jolly fat man with the rosy cheek, who saved me from a certain death only to turn traitor and sell me into servitude. Nor of the dreadful candle manufactory at Marblehead, where I was shackled to a great iron cauldron of boiling pig fat, and forced to stir that disgusting bile with a large wooden spoon. And what of the wretched sort with whom I was forced to keep company? Of the street urchins, the pickpockets, and the awful orphan boys who mocked me for my gentility. Even today the memory sticks in my throat. Whilst I was employed in the dreaded candle factory belonging to Mr. Worthington, the foreman required that we lads attend service at Salem. And it was at the church that I resolved to extricate myself from the doldrums of common labour. I first charmed the minister, and obtained from him instruction in reading and elocution. He lent me books, and I practised my letters by the light of the bubbling pig-fat, and still more ingeniously practised enunciation to rid my words of their rustic accent. I brushed my clothes, and polished my shoes, and made myself handsome and agreeable. The wretched are wont to complain of their misfortune, which they assign to forces beyond their control. I had no family, I had no education, I had no costly furs. But consider only that there was no more wretched than I during those years, and yet I have overcome each obstacle that has been placed before me. I had no father to teach me how to seduce an old widow. I had no instruction on how to deceive my enemies. It was by sheer cunning and daring that I won the favour of the Dowager of Salem. Yes, indeed, the great Dowager of Salem, Mrs. Esther Higginbottom. The minister had recommended me to her as a boy in want of spiritual advancement. She was a woman of immense property, and soon succumbed to my advances. "A boy such as you can make hay from crabgrass," the dowager was fond of saying. Thus she took me from the candle manufactory, and repaired me to the schoolroom, where I excelled in Latin, mathematics, fencing, and dancing. She bought me fine coats and expensive furs, and I strode the cobblestone path as handsome and gay as any of those boys whose station I had so coveted in my childhood. All of these things would make fine reading, and greatly edify posterity. But I have no leisure to talk of such pursuits. In fact, I have never before allowed those memories to be spoken. Instead, I choose to begin the story of my life in the year and season when I was sent up to Cambridge. It is a fitting start to a most extraordinary tale.